Hi everyone, it's Rusty again, and when I was making my previous video on technology on the trail, it got me to thinking about how much things have changed in hiking over the past 50 years. Stay tuned for a discussion about that. So what got me really to thinking about this is a comment I got from somebody I don't know, and that's always exciting on my channel when I get a comment from somebody I don't know because it's so rare. And this was from a Clara M. And she said that she thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in 1979 with an external frame backpack, a compass, and a tarp for shelter. She says, I made fires to heat coffee and what meals that she cooked. And technology's not always reliable, so I still don't use it. Well, Clara makes two very good points in this comment, one very explicit and the other one a little more implicit. The explicit point she makes is that technology is not always reliable. And of course, that means for a lot of cases, bringing a backup with you. Well, if you're going to bring a backup to your technology and you're going to bear the burden of carrying both, then why bother with the technology? That is a valid way of looking at it. Her implicit point really was that there's different ways to enjoy the hiking experience, and I absolutely 100% agree with that. So by comparison, I've never thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, but I did do my first lash also in 1979. So Clara and I are contemporaries. I had an external frame pack. I made fires to cook. I did have a tent. I didn't use a tarp. I had a tent. It weighed 7.5 pounds, so I probably would have been better off with a tarp. And another thing she doesn't happen to mention, but I'm going to mention, I did not treat drinking water back then, and that's going to be an important part of what I have to discuss. So I really ought to discuss what is technology. My previous video was talking about electronics technology, but really, technology covers a lot. It does cover the hiking-specific electronics, such as the tracker and your phone apps. There are the general electronics, such as the phone that your hiker apps run on. Battery backups. These are just things that really you could use in different walks of life, not just hiking. But lightweight hiking equipment is also a technology. For example, your lightweight backpack, your tent, the materials, the Dyneema, Cuban fiber, it used to be called, now it's called Dyneema. Your sleep system, we used to think of it as a sleeping bag, but you have other things with your sleep system. If you bring a pillow, your mattress, whatever you bring with you. Your stove is technology, and water treatment is technology. Now, of course, when it comes to cooking, actually a fire is technology too, so we'll get into that a little more. So one of the drivers of change has been the popularity of the trail. Now, this chart here is actually, the data is from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. This was a chart that I found on the Far Out website. And it shows the number of 2,000 miler certifications. And a 2,000 miler certification is basically you report that you have completed the trail, maybe not as a thru hike, could be as a thru hike, or just through a series of section hikes. So this isn't the number of people on the trail or anything like that, but I think proportionally it shows the growth. This is just kind of a proxy for the growth on the trail. And the blue line is the number of people who have registered for this. And you can see it kind of goes up and down, and there are different events that happen. The Walk in the Woods book by Bill Bryson had a temporary spike in the popularity and it went back down. But I think this red dotted line just kind of shows the growth. We went from back in the 1970s from maybe less than 100 people a year to over 1,000 people a year by 2018. So over that span of time, a tenfold increase in the number of people out on the trail. Now, one of the consequences of this is that the average capability of the hikers attempting a long hike has gone down. Now, that's not a knock on the hikers. When you have more and more people, more and more recreational people, instead of a thru hike being something that only the very few and prepared, such as Clara, could do back in the 70s, now a lot more people can attempt it. And their preparedness for it, just on average, has to go down. Now, the number of people who complete a thru hike that they start out is around 20%. I suspect it was a lot higher back in the 1970s. And I think there's a washout rate. There's good articles claiming or showing how there's early washout. In other words, a lot of people start and then they drop out before they even get out of Georgia if they're going south to north. Another consequence of this popularity, though, is that overcrowding must be planned around. Now, when I went on my hike this year, I happened to pick a time where I was headed south, where the northbounders through hikers had already gotten past me, and the southbounders weren't where I was. And I told a few people I did run into that I was the loneliest man on the trail. So it is possible to avoid that overcrowding by judicious scheduling. Easier if you're doing sections like I do, or even lashes like I do, as opposed to a through hike where you're a little bit more limited in your choices. But it is possible to avoid the overcrowding. One of the changes that the popularity of the trail has driven is the availability of logistics and services. A long hike along the Appalachian Trail anyway is a lot less logistically daunting now than it was 50 years ago. For one thing, the availability of hostels, shuttles, and hiker resupply services. Clara mentioned that there were 300 through hikers in 1979. Well, 300 through hikers, that means if you're trying to run a business that's based on them, you're going to have maybe 2 or 3 of them going by in a day. You can't build a business on that. Well, 20 or 30, maybe you can build a business on it. Trail angels and trail magic. I ran into no trail angels and no trail magic back in 1979. In 2021, one of my hikes was up in Maine, and I wouldn't have made it without a trail angel who actually provided me with some food, basically. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I had miscalculated on my food. Shame on me, but she helped me get through it. Information services, I kind of beat this on my last video, so I'm not going to go into it here, but the information services such as you get from far out, and of course the safety that you get from the inReach tracker, and I've kind of beaten that horse quite a bit too. A secondary effect of this is that it's slightly physically easier to complete the trail. Not enough to mitigate the inexperience out there, but by slightly easier, I mean with hostels, you can stop and take a 0 day and resupply instead of having to rush to get to the next post office to pick up your drop of supplies and stuff like that. So I think all this hiking boom has actually made it slightly easier. So let's talk about cooking. It's a fact. It's becoming less possible to cook over an open fire everywhere. A lot of places have restrictions against it because of forest fire hazards. Wood supplies are being camped out when you have 10 times as many people going through a popular area, just no firewood to build a fire with. There are fire dangers, for example, in the Grand Canyon. It may seem that there's nothing to burn there, but there's plenty to burn there. The problem is you can't control it, so you can't have a fire for cooking out in the Grand Canyon. You have to bring a stove with you. And I've seen that even on parts of the Appalachian Trail. So that means for a lot of your cooking, for a lot of your eating, either bringing a stove, or doing cold soaking, which means not cooking, just kind of, if you need to rehydrate food, just do it with cold water. Takes a lot longer. I think it probably doesn't taste as good, at least in my mind, but that's just me. Anyways, those have become a necessity in many areas. And remember, matches are also a technology, and it's a technology that can fail. If your matches get wet and they're not waterproofed somehow, you can end up with no way to start a fire. So I bring a couple lighters with me, and I've never had them fail. So let's talk about water treatment. So the first case of Giardia, beaver fever it's sometimes called, occurred in the US in Colorado in 1970. So by 1979, well, I actually first went hiking with my father in 1969 and hiked for off and on for the next 10 years. By 1979, you could still get away with drinking untreated water. I mean, from Colorado, beaver fever hadn't made its way around. It had made it by the mid 80s, because I remember it being a problem in the town that I was working in. So you could drink untreated water. But let's remember these usage statistics. Like I showed in that graph earlier, here it is again. There's a 10-fold increase in the popularity of the trail. And that has a big impact on the environment, not just the increase in civilization encroaching on the wild areas, but also the number of people out there. Here's a chart from the CDC on the effectiveness of different water treatments. And I use a filter. And I was kind of shocked to see the thing that stands out in the filter column there is that big red X for norovirus and similar viruses. Norovirus is actually a problem when I was out on the trail this year. A bunch of hikers caught norovirus. And they said, oh, they filtered the water. Well, guess what? Filtering isn't good enough. So there are other options. I bring a chlorine dioxide with me, which I haven't used so far, but I think I'm going to start, because if you use chloride in combination with a filter, you've got everything taken care of. Now, my filter is a 0.2 micron, and here it says the standard is a 0.3 micron. So, you know, my filter meets the criteria for taking care of all these things. Another choice is the ultraviolet SteriPen, which I also own one of, and that is also technology, and it worries me that it could break. And there are difficulties with using these things in combination with my filter. With my filter, it's real simple. I just filter right into my bag and, you know, start drinking. Now, the SteriPen is great, but the water's got to be clear, like it says here. Now, the filter would take care of a lot of that and probably make most water clear enough for the SteriPen to work. But the SteriPen can only do a certain amount at a time and has to be in a closed container. The chlorine dioxide is good, but it takes a while to take effect. So I have to work out the logistics of how I'm going to use this. I'm probably going to end up throwing some of the chemical in my platypus bladder, but then have to drink from the reserve bottle in the meantime until the chemical has its opportunity to take effect. But I think that's important. That is something we didn't have to worry about back in the 60s and 70s, and it's something you're playing Russian roulette if you don't worry about it now. Another thing that's changed over the past 50 years, Privies. In many locations, and I think they're finding their way into almost all locations, moldering privies have replaced pit privies. A pit privy is what I call my Uncle Ted's outhouse. I mean, that's the standard stinky, you don't want to go in there, but you have to take care of business. The moldering privies, they're much more sanitary, they're much more environmentally friendly, and they're the ones where you usually throw a handful of mulch or leaves or something that's kind of equivalent to flushing. Not to be too crude about it, but the volume fills up, and when it's full, usually the outhouses are like double seaters. They will move the seating arrangement to the other side. They will let the full area compost, do a little bit of treatment in the meantime, and by the time the second side is full, the first side is actually good, clean, environmentally friendly compost, mulch, whatever that can be spread around the forest floor. So that is a much better way to do it. Now, there's this book, which I will euphemistically call How to Do Poopies in the Woods. And just to show you, I actually do own the book, and it is by Kathleen Meyer. And it was an eye-opener. I'm not through the whole thing yet. My kids got it for me for my birthday. When I'm in Tennessee, this is actually going to be an issue because I looked on far out in the northernmost 140 miles going into Damascus, Virginia, which is mostly in Tennessee. There are not privies. So I generally try camping around shelters because there's usually a privy there and a water supply. During that section of trail, I may be more inclined to take unofficial but established campsites if there's water there, because I'm going to have to be following the instructions in this book, and I will be digging cat holes and whatever. It's an unpleasant subject, but it's got to be done. So the conclusion, well, the hiking boom that's occurred over the past 50 years, it comes with pluses and minuses. On the plus side, there's better support services, better on-trail facilities, and near-trail facilities. The equipment quality has certainly gone up. I no longer have to haul a 55-pound pack around like I did in 1979. Now my pack is closer to, it's usually under 30 pounds unless I have a big supply of water or a big supply of food. And I think I'm better prepared with that, say 28 pounds than I was with the pack that was twice as heavy. And of course, the availability of information through the technology and the safety through the tracker. On the downside, I'll say, there are cooking and fire restrictions that didn't used to be there back 50 years ago. There is the issue of seasonal crowding. Now, like I said, you can plan around that. I have, and I'm thinking in 2023, I think I've successfully planned around that. Time will tell when I'm out on the trail. And water purity, that's the big one. So thanks for listening. See you next time.